And I started to say no, and I was looking around for Gregory Peck, and my wife nudged me and said, "Go ahead, you can do it for him." And I was, boom.
For decades, Angie Dickinson's life has shimmered beneath the golden light of Hollywood's most glamorous era. She was bold, magnetic, and stunning in a way that didn't just turn heads, it turned hearts. Her presence on screen carried a rare blend of charm and strength that made her unforgettable. But behind the glitter and the camera flashes, Angie's real story was one of passion, heartbreak, and haunting silence. For years, whispers floated through the industry. Whispers about the man who had stolen her heart and never truly given it back. That man was Robert Redford. To the public, their connection was fleeting, nothing more than a Hollywood rumor, but to Angie, it was something far deeper, something she kept hidden, buried beneath decades of pride and pain. Now, at 93, she finally speaks, not to expose scandal, but to reflect on a love that shaped her in ways even she can't forget. Their story doesn't begin with fireworks or publicity. It begins quietly, like many Hollywood stories do, on a set under bright lights that disguise everything but the truth that lingers between takes. It was the late 1960s, and Robert Redford was on the rise. He was the golden boy of a new generation, all confidence, charm, and quiet power. Angie was already established, admired for her elegance and intelligence as much as her beauty. She was a woman who didn't need validation, but when Redford walked onto the set, something about him disarmed her. He wasn't like the others, not desperate for attention, not drowning in ego. There was a calmness about him, a steady strength that drew her in without a word. She later admitted that Redford had a kind of light, a glow that seemed to come from within, not from fame. At the time, both were committed to their careers, and both carried emotional baggage from relationships that had left their scars. Angie was married to composer Burt Bacharach, a union that had long since begun to crumble under the weight of distance and unspoken resentment. Redford was still navigating fame's early chaos, struggling to balance the man he wanted to be with the man Hollywood demanded. Their connection wasn't immediate infatuation. It was a slow burn, a deep curiosity that grew stronger each time their paths crossed. On set, they shared easy laughter and an understanding that went beyond flirtation. There was something unspoken between them, an invisible thread of emotion that neither dared to name. Hollywood, of course, thrives on speculation. Rumors swirled that the two had grown close during filming, but both remained silent, careful not to fuel the gossip. Angie wasn't the kind of woman who confessed love easily. She once said, "In this town, the minute you tell the truth about your heart, someone will try to use it against you." So she stayed quiet, graceful, controlled, even when the chemistry between them was undeniable. For Redford, who had seen plenty of superficial admiration, Angie was different. She wasn't chasing him. She wasn't impressed by his fame. She saw the man beneath the actor, and that's what made her unforgettable. In private moments, when the cameras stopped rolling, they talked about everything, their fears, their failures, the strange loneliness that came with being adored by millions but understood by none. Angie once described Redford as the kind of man who could listen without judgment, and that perhaps was what made her fall for him. In a world full of noise, he was silence, calm, grounded, genuine. Yet, like many Hollywood love stories, timing was their enemy. Angie's marriage was complicated, tied up in obligations and guilt, especially toward her daughter, Leah, who struggled with health issues. Redford, ever cautious about emotional entanglements, didn't push her. Their bond deepened in glances, conversations, and brief encounters that felt both fleeting and eternal. But Hollywood doesn't let love stay pure for long. There were whispers from those close to them, assistants, producers, journalists, who noticed how their eyes lingered just a little too long, how their laughter carried a warmth that didn't belong to co-stars. Some claimed that their friendship was innocent. Others swore it was an affair that neither could fully end. Angie never confirmed anything publicly, but her eyes often gave away what her words never did. Years later, when asked about Redford, she smiled softly and said, "He's one of the good ones. The rare kind you never stop admiring." That wasn't the kind of thing a woman said about just anyone. Their connection stretched over decades, not constant, but enduring. Even as Redford's career skyrocketed with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting, and Angie continued to shine in roles that showcased her poise and fire, they remained tethered by an unspoken affection. Friends who knew them both said there was always a certain warmth when Redford's name came up. Angie, who had seen the worst of Hollywood's egos, spoke of him with quiet respect, calling him genuine in a world that rarely is. She once admitted, in a rare interview, that Redford had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room, and those words alone revealed more emotion than any public confession could. Still, what made their story so haunting wasn't what happened, but what didn't. It was the love that never quite got to exist fully. Trapped between loyalty, circumstance, and timing, Angie often wondered what might have been if they'd met under different circumstances. If she hadn't been married, if fame hadn't been such a demanding force in both their lives. But she never allowed herself to dwell on regret. Some people, she once said, you don't have to love forever. You just love them once, and it changes you for life. For Redford, too, the connection was never forgotten. Though he remained private about his personal life, those close to him said he always spoke of Angie with fondness and admiration. She wasn't just another actress he'd worked with. She was someone who understood him in ways few did. As the years passed and their paths drifted apart, both carried the memory quietly, never tarnishing it with bitterness or blame. Now in her later years, as Angie looks back at the love stories that shaped her, Robert Redford's name still stands apart. It isn't the loudest chapter, or even the longest, but it's the one that lingers like a melody that never fades. It was tender, unspoken, and perhaps unfinished, but maybe that's what made it so pure. Sometimes the love that never happens completely is the one that stays forever. As the 1970s rolled on, Hollywood was changing, and so was Angie Dickinson. She was entering her prime, the kind of woman who could command a scene with a single glance. Her allure wasn't just in her beauty. It was in her intelligence, her self-assuredness, and her refusal to be defined by any man, no matter how powerful. Yet even as she built her legacy through unforgettable performances, there was a quiet emptiness that fame couldn't fill. The same emptiness that surfaced every time she thought of Robert Redford. It wasn't about what could have been. It was about what never truly left her. He had become a symbol of something deeper, something real in a world that often felt fake. And for a woman like Angie, who had seen everything Hollywood had to offer, the glitz, the gossip, the betrayals, that kind of authenticity was rare. Her marriage to Burt Bacharach had once been one of Hollywood's most glamorous unions. They were beautiful, talented, and sophisticated, the golden couple everyone envied. But behind closed doors, the picture was far less perfect. Burt, brilliant as he was, could also be distant. Music consumed him, and Angie, despite her strength, often felt like she was living in someone else's shadow. Their daughter, Leah, born prematurely, faced lifelong health struggles, which placed enormous strain on their relationship. Angie adored her daughter fiercely and made countless sacrifices to care for her, but the emotional toll was immense. Through it all, Redford remained a quiet ghost in her memory, not a temptation, but a reminder of how deeply she could feel when someone truly saw her. There were moments when they crossed paths again, at events, premieres, award shows. They always greeted each other with warmth, never awkwardness. Those who saw them together noticed the ease between them as though no time had passed. Redford, ever composed, treated her with genuine respect. Angie once said in a private interview that he had a way of making people feel calm, like the world slowed down around him. She admired that about him. He was centered, she recalled, like he'd made peace with who he was. And I think I always envied that. That sense of inner balance was something she craved but rarely found in her own life. By the 1980s, Angie was one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. She wasn't just a sex symbol anymore. She was a pioneer for women on television. Her role in Policewoman made her a household name and opened doors for actresses in crime dramas for decades to come. She worked tirelessly, never afraid to take on roles that pushed boundaries. But even as her career soared, her personal life remained complicated. Her marriage finally ended, leaving her with both freedom and loneliness. In interviews, she laughed off questions about romance, often saying she was too busy to fall in love again. Yet those close to her knew that behind that playful grin was a woman who had loved deeply once and never fully recovered from it. As Redford's fame reached new heights with films like The Natural and Out of Africa, Angie admired him from afar. She saw how he stayed true to himself, how he never let Hollywood consume him. He became a director, a producer, and an activist, carving out a career that reflected his quiet integrity. She respected that deeply. In a rare moment of honesty, Angie once admitted that Redford had been the only man who never made me feel like I had to change. Coming from a woman who had spent her life surrounded by men who tried to mold her into their version of perfection. That was no small statement. Still, she never allowed herself to reach out, even as the years slipped away. Pride, timing, and life itself stood in the way. She poured her energy into her work, her daughter, and her independence. Hollywood often painted her as the strong, untouchable woman, but those who knew her intimately said she was far more sensitive than she let on. Late at night, she would sometimes play old jazz records, her favorite being Chet Baker, and stare out at the city lights. Friends say she once confessed that certain songs reminded her of him, especially the ones that carried a quiet sadness. It wasn't longing exactly, and it was remembrance. The kind of ache that comes from knowing someone had once touched your soul, even if they never stayed. In interviews during the 1990s, Angie's name came up less often in gossip columns and more in retrospectives. She was admired for her longevity, her class, and her honesty. When asked about her romantic past, she never sensationalized it. "I had my share of heartbreaks," she would say, "but I wouldn't change them. They made me who I am." She never named Redford directly. She didn't need to. The emotion in her eyes when his name was mentioned said everything. "He was different," she once said softly, "and maybe that's why it never could have worked. We were too much alike in some ways, too careful in others." Redford, for his part, remained as discreet as ever. He never spoke publicly about Angie, but those close to him said he held a quiet respect for her throughout his life. They had shared something genuine, something that didn't need validation or explanation. Hollywood romances come and go, but connections like theirs, built on mutual understanding rather than chaos, are the ones that linger longest. By the time the new millennium arrived, Angie had slowed down professionally but never lost her wit or charm. She appeared in interviews and documentaries, often joking about her age and saying she was too old for regrets. But when the topic of love surfaced, there was always a pause, a brief flicker of nostalgia that told a deeper story. She didn't talk about lost love with bitterness. She spoke about it with gratitude. "You don't forget someone like that," she said once. "You just learn to carry them differently." For Angie Dickinson, Robert Redford wasn't a chapter she closed. He was a part of her she quietly kept, a memory she never needed to rewrite. It wasn't about scandal or heartbreak. It was about the quiet grace of loving someone from afar and knowing that sometimes love doesn't need an ending to be real. As the years passed and the golden light of Hollywood's classic era dimmed, Angie Dickinson began to retreat from the public eye. Fame had given her so much: recognition, admiration, legacy, but it had also taken pieces of her heart along the way. In her quiet moments, away from the cameras and the red carpets, she began to take stock of the life she had lived. The men, the movies, the moments, they all blurred together like a dream half remembered. Yet one presence in her story remained vivid, untouched by time: Robert Redford. Decades had passed since their lives had intertwined, but whenever his name appeared on screen or in conversation, her face softened. It wasn't regret she felt. It was something gentler, like gratitude mixed with melancholy. "He was one of the few," she once whispered to a friend, "who saw me, not the actress, not the image, just me." By the 2000s, Angie was no longer the fiery Hollywood star who commanded every frame. She had become a quiet icon, the kind of woman younger actresses looked up to for her grace and authenticity. She wasn't chasing roles anymore, but her legacy continued to grow. The industry had changed, and she often commented on how fast everything moved now, how little room there was for real connection. She said it reminded her of why Redford had always felt different. "He didn't rush," she said in an interview. "He took his time with people, and that's rare." There was an affection in her tone when she spoke of him, one that no amount of years could disguise. Angie had many admirers over the years, Frank Sinatra among them. Their friendship had once been a whirlwind of laughter and glamour, but even he couldn't anchor her heart the way Redford had. With Redford, it had never been about grand gestures or declarations. It was about understanding. There was something steady about him that grounded her, something she came to appreciate even more as she grew older. "I think when you get to my age," she once mused, "you stop remembering the faces and start remembering the feelings." And some feelings just never fade. Her daughter Leah's passing in 2007 was perhaps the hardest chapter of Angie's life. Leah had been her reason for everything, the quiet center around which her world revolved. When she died, Angie felt the ground shift beneath her. Friends say that during those dark months, Angie found comfort in the simplest things: old photographs, music, and letters she had kept for decades. Among them, there were notes and mementos from a time long ago, a handwritten card with Redford's name among them. She never revealed what it said, but those close to her said she held on to it with care, like a relic from another life. It wasn't about rekindling an old flame. It was about holding on to a piece of peace that had once existed, a reminder that love, even unfulfilled, could still be healing. By this time, Robert Redford had also grown older, gracefully stepping back from acting while focusing on directing and environmental causes. Angie admired how he aged with dignity, without chasing relevance or clinging to his youth. "He never pretended," she said once, "and I think that's what I loved most about him." He was never trying to be anyone else. In many ways, Angie saw in Redford the kind of man Hollywood rarely produces anymore, one with conviction, humility, and depth. It's why, even after all these years, her admiration never turned to bitterness. Their paths had gone in different directions, but the emotional truth between them remained timeless. In later interviews, journalists often tried to coax her into naming the great love of her life. She would laugh it off, sometimes teasing, sometimes deflecting. But one day, in a rare moment of honesty, she said, "The greatest love stories aren't always the ones that end in marriage. Sometimes they're the ones that teach you what love really is." She didn't have to say his name. Everyone who knew her story understood. Robert Redford wasn't her husband, her partner, or her lifelong companion, but he had been something more elusive, the one who showed her what sincerity looked like. Angie was never bitter about love. She once said that if she had the chance to relive her life, she wouldn't change much, not even the heartbreak. "Everything happens the way it's meant to," she told a friend. "Even the ones who get away. Maybe they were never meant to stay. Maybe they were just meant to wake something up inside you." That was how she viewed Redford, not as a loss, but as a quiet awakening that shaped who she became. In her twilight years, as she looked back on the men who had crossed her path, Sinatra, Bacharach, and countless admirers, she often said Redford stood apart because he never tried to own her. "He respected me," she said, "and that's a rare thing in this business." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. For a woman who had spent her life in an industry that tried to define her by her beauty, that kind of respect meant everything. When asked in a recent documentary how she wanted to be remembered, Angie smiled softly and said, "As someone who loved deeply, even when I didn't say it." And perhaps that was her quiet confession, the one she'd guarded for over 50 years. Because beneath all the glitz, the fame, and the stories, there was a part of her heart that had always belonged to Robert Redford, not in the way tabloids imagine, but in the way that truly matters. It was a connection built on sincerity, trust, and timing that never quite aligned, and yet somehow it lasted a lifetime. Now, at 93, Angie speaks not with regret, but with wisdom. She doesn't romanticize the past, nor does she deny it. "I think," she once said, her voice barely above a whisper, "some people just leave a light in you. Even after they're gone, it's still there, glowing softly. That's what he was to me, a light." And in that quiet truth lies the essence of Angie Dickinson's story. A story not of lost love, but of love that transcended time, distance, and silence.